The last thing we look at in this chapter is when to and when not to use this model. This model makes some critical assumptions. So some of these key assumptions are the following. There are many identical firms and consumers. And this means that no individual can affect the price on their own. We call this the price-taking assumption. So each consumer or each actor in this economy takes the prices given and just decides the optimal thing to do for given those prices. In micro 2, you'll see what happens when the price-taking assumption doesn't hold. So when you look at monopolies and oligopolies, for example, you'll analyze the situation when you don't have price takers. But the model we've developed so far is one where everybody's a price taker. And that we're going to keep that assumption throughout this course. We're also assuming here that everybody has full information. In other words, everybody knows all the prices and all the characteristics of the different goods. This is a pretty strict assumption. It's a pretty strong assumption. It applies sometimes to some markets, but it's not always the appropriate assumption. So think of situations like insurance. The consumer knows a lot about the riskiness of the thing that they're trying to insure, but the seller of the insurance product doesn't necessarily know. So this type of asymmetric information in particular is tricky and isn't well handled by this type of a model. We're also assuming that there's no transaction cost. So as long as there's a seller who has a lower cost to producing a good than the value that a consumer ascribes to consuming that good, we assume that that's a good trade to happen. Which would be true if there were no transaction costs. But if there are transaction costs, that might not be the case. So in this model, we're assuming that there are no transaction costs. We're also going to assume here that firms can easily enter and exit the market. Again, we're going to reanalyze all these in far more detail later on towards the end of the course. But it's important to know that all these things that we're looking at here are making these assumptions. And these assumptions are pretty critical to the conclusions we're going to draw. Now, these assumptions seldom hold in reality. So it's not uncommon to have small or identical, or not to have small identical firms and consumers, right? So think of utilities. There's effectively only two companies that sell internet in the Ottawa area. There's only one hydro company. So these are not small firms that have identical competitors. Think of an artist. There's only one of a kind. So there isn't an identical firm that can compete with them. For full information, think of, like I said, insurance, or think of the used car market. I know how the way I've maintained my car. You don't know how I've maintained my car. So in a used car market, there's a lot of asymmetric information. We see broker's fees all over the place, right? So transaction costs do exist. There's just a cost of showing up to going at a market and engaging in trade. And it's not necessarily always true that firms can easily enter and exit a market. So if there's investment that needs to happen, if there's fixed costs, this is certainly not going to be true. There's often regulatory restrictions, so there often is a burden or a barrier to entry into a given market. So these models are an idealized version of the economy, and they're good as a benchmark, but we have to take them with a grain of salt and understand that there are limitations that these models have. And when we look at the conclusions we draw, we should then understand and evaluate, when we apply those conclusions to the real world, we should say, okay, well, to what extent are the assumptions of this model validated in the context where I'm trying to apply these conclusions?